Welcome to Drink Beer, Think Beer, the podcast that gets to the bottom of every pint. I'm John Hall, and this week I'm talking with Jake Miller. He's a co-founder and a brewer at Heirloom Rustic Ales in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I want to get into the interview quickly because I found Jake to be a thoughtful guy and a brewer that is intent on not following a set path, and you're going to hear about that. Before launching Heirloom a few years ago, he cut his teeth at breweries like Prairie Artisan Ales, Wolves and People, and Saint Somewhere. And along the way, he picked up different brewing techniques and a sense for the aesthetics that make for a good brewery and channeled it into his own place. And I had the chance to visit Oklahoma a few years ago, before his brewery opened, but right when the big changes were coming to the state beer-wise. And Oklahoma is a state that we don't actually hear much about when it comes to the beer scene, so I wanted to start there, with what's happening on the ground. Jake spoke to me from the brewery in Tulsa. Here's our conversation.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy because I guess when I started brewing, we kind of had this crazy idea. When I was at Prairie Artisan Ales, we were like, oh, well, I think we can make 4% beers and sell them in the tap room directly to consumers. And so we were the first tap room to sell these beers. And basically it was just kind of using the loophole that, macro beer had made. And so we just started making 4% beers and we would have people show up from out of state that, were just bomb fanatics, and they'd walk in and see whole pallets of this stuff and be like, oh my gosh, I'm going to buy a whole case. And we couldn't even sell it to them. And,
and that's just got to be beyond frustrating.
Oh, for everyone. I mean, because, then I look like an asshole because I'm, going, yeah, man, that's not going to happen. We can't do it legally. And they're like, well, I'm from South Carolina. And I'm like, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And,
it's like, cool.
But I got this 4% Goza for you that I know you're dying to have. And, and so it ended up being this thing for like the first 6 months was more frustrating than anything. Cause, everybody just wanted what the brand was known for. And we were making these really light, English mild Pilsners, Gozas, those kind of things that work in the 4% category, but that's all we could sell. So for me, it was like my dream tap room. And then we just had so many frustrated people out of there because they would just be looking at beers heading to distro. And there was nothing we could sell them. And then there was another brewery locally that, so they got their actual bar license, and you would see them shipping out into a truck a pallet of kegs that was literally going to go sit in a warehouse and then get delivered right back to them the next day, priced at the distributors' margins. So it's like, it was a crazy, and that was all, like 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And then so once there was kind of chatter that these laws were going to change, I started talking to some friends that were, closer to the legislature and kind of knew what was going on. And they were like, yes, for sure, this is going to happen. And so we announced almost, I don't know, it was probably 2 or 3 months after I heard that, we announced that we were going to open. And then, man, I thought we were going to be able to be like one of only a few new breweries for at least like a year. But every month it was 1 and 2 breweries opening somewhere in Oklahoma as soon as those laws changed.
Well, I mean, and that makes sense. If it's easier to do business, people are going to do business. And there's still, Prairie is still, I think, is probably the best known craft brewer from your state, like outside of the states. And that's not really to put a knock on what anybody else is doing, but it's longevity and, some of those early recipes that made an impact. Is there, when I think of how there are different regions in the country and what brewers collectively sort of tend towards or trend towards, is there Is there a way of sort of putting a point on what Oklahoma beer is these days?
Man, I don't know. That's I think that's a hard question to answer for almost any region. Like it's
That's why I'm here, man. I'm just here to confound and delight and all of the other things.
Yeah, no, I think you're onto it. That's a hard question to answer because I mean I think you can go to these different places where you're like, oh well, I drink this beer here. It's kind of like whenever you go to Maine and you're drinking Allagash White. It's like the benchmark for that state, and no matter what anybody else in that state does, I think it'll always kind of stand in the shadow of that beer. But you don't also see like everybody in that region making wit beer or some sort of Belgian,
Yeah.
spin off of that beer. And, it's kind of like here, I still think if you were to ask, people all over the country what Oklahoma beer they're familiar with, they're still going to say bomb. And,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean that every brewery here or even half the breweries here have anything like that beer. And so I don't know. I feel like there's regional staples that we can look at and go, this beer defines this region or these beers define that region, but it doesn't necessarily influence how anybody else in that region's brewing beer.
Mm-hmm. That makes
And
yeah.
I don't, the closest thing I think you can actually get to that, and it's like one of my favorite cities to drink in. And it also just makes so much philosophical sense for the place, but is Austin. When I go there, it's like there's probably 6 Pilsners that I'm just dying to drink. And I don't know of very many places in the country about any kind of beer where it's just like, oh, I can't wait to get my hands on all these, benchmark of whatever style.
Yeah. Why did you become a brewer?
That's a good question. I think ultimately I was just really attracted to the idea of it. I started off as a bartender in craft beer bars. And when I was, I don't know, I was just really into picking apart everything about those beers and learning as much as I could. And so obviously the idea of crafting those things it didn't take very long to make that jump, that was a thing that I think I could be interested in. And I finally got a job doing it. And then what kind of happened that maybe I wasn't expecting is realizing that it was this kind of perfect conglomeration of all of these aspects that I had either studied or thrown myself at for so long. And it like, even when I was in college, I was a major in art and biology, and all of these things started coming together of like, oh my gosh, this is like, it's really challenging because there's all these different things going on at once. And I can, whether it's forming a label, forming a brand, marketing the brand, and then there's recipe development, figuring out how you're going to make yeast viable for as long as possible. How many yeast pitches am I going to use? There's like so much going on. And it's one of the only things that I've ever felt completely challenged by, no matter how long I do it. And for me, that's important. I think I get bored super fast. And as soon as I figure out a job, it's hard for that job to fulfill me any longer because I've got it down. And this is something that I think I'm in year 7 or 8 at this point, and it still feels like the wheel gets reinvented all the time for things I could learn, things I could be doing better. And so, I mean, I love it.
So I think that's a pretty good segue into a couple weeks ago. You announced through your social media panels or social media channels, I should say, that you were going to be releasing your last oak age wild ale release. And when I first got to know your brewery, a lot of these mixed firm coming out of wood is what you were known for. And to be a few years into this now and to say, hey, we're known for this and we're not going to do this anymore.
Yeah.
Can you walk me through where that decision came from and how it was executed and where you go from here?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's kind of I guess, interesting for, it's a great lesson and reminder that no one's in your head but yourself too. Because for me, I definitely thought when we were announcing that it was kind of like a no-brainer, and that people maybe saw it coming for a long time. But basically, there wasn't like a backlash. It was just I had all these people reach out to me and go, hey, what's going on? Are you all right? Like almost trying to like talk me off a ledge. And for us, I I think it goes back to the reputation that you build when you're first doing this and you first start out. Is the reputation that people will almost always know you for, and to shift at all takes a long time. And so for us, we've released maybe 2 or 3 mixed culture beers a year since we opened. So it's not even making up 2% of what we release. But because coming from mixed culture backgrounds and mixed culture ferments, and that being when your reputation is on Prairie, Wolves and People, and Saint Somewhere, this kind of idea of who you are as a brewer and what you would always want is established, whether or not you're a part of establishing it or not. And this brand has really never reflected those products, and it's never been a major showcase or narrative for us. But we're still, I think there's people that walk into our tap rooms still to this day and just expect fruited mixed culture beers to just start taking up draft lines. And it's, even though we've been telling them for I guess 3.5 years now that that's not going to happen. There's still that expectation that you're going to remember who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of, I don't know, I guess it's a good lesson in a sense too, that I need to be more vocal about what we're up to and reinforcing that. Because I think our communication since Heirloom started has been pretty clear that we're making simple beers. Kolsch and Lager have been the beers we've been most focused on since we opened, but it literally has just never hit that's what we're doing. And I think putting that post out and getting all these messages, it was like, guys, come on. You know this. We've been talking about this for years, and everybody who was talking to me, even 4 and 5 years ago at different brands knew this was kind of a thing that was bubbling up inside of me. And but as soon as you actually, I guess, say it with hard fact, this is the end, then you start getting all these people who are like, no, don't do it. And which is flattering too. I mean, it's cool that people think highly of those kinds of beers that you're making. It's just never will cease to amaze me that it's really hard to come out of a thing that you've become in this industry.
I imagine it's a never say never again kind of thing. And if it's such a small part of what the brewery was doing, I imagine a lot of people were asking, well, why don't you just keep doing it then?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a fair question. I think, a downside of my personality is that I'm extremely passionate and focused. And it's hard for me to make these really, it's hard for me to not focus on being the most authentic thing I can be. And so sometimes that looks like, losing some of these focuses, and so that I can become even more singular in a way. And I've, with barrels, it's hard to explain until you have a cellar full of them. um, you're just constantly looking at these things that are taking up space and that are slowly dying. um, and for me, it was that I wasn't enthusiastic about blending them, there. And that was the sign that things had really changed for me. I remember when I used to just hate, working on the stainless side of things, and just loathed it. And but as soon as, there was a blend day, it would like make up for my next 2 months of whatever adjunct stout hell I had to go through. And I just didn't feel that anymore at all. I'd come in and look at barrels and just almost slump and be like, what am I going to do with these things? And and so that's a hard thing to communicate to people who love something that you're doing, because you don't want to tell them that you're burnt out on it. And but at the same time, it got to a point where it's just like, I don't need to communicate all that, but I am going to communicate that this is no longer a thing that we're doing and that you can expect from us. And
Did you feel a weight lifted when you finally put that post up?
yeah, absolutely. That's it. Also is kind of, this risk, I guess, in a way that I've been kind of towing the water on taking. And that I think I needed to fully jump in and go, you know what, like, I've been talking like this for like 4 years now. It's time that I actually, fully commit to it. And which no one requires that. Almost every brewery that opens now, it's like, well, here's our barrel room, and
Well,
here's our horizontal lager tanks. And like,
well, I don't know. I don't know too many breweries that have horizontal lager tanks. I'd love to see more of that, but yeah.
Yeah. It's and I guess that's just me sarcastically.
No, but you're right though that people open up with 3 barrels in a corner and they're like, "Well, here's our wood age project going on," and it's like,
right.
All right, like, cool.
Yeah, no, it's like I never thought I'd live in a world where people are like, "Well, during the construction phase, here's my spontaneous room," and I'm like, "What?" Like this. There were 5 or 6 of us doing this, even 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And now you can be a home brewer that's never commercially brewed in your life, and you have a barrel room, a spontaneous room, and then all these different, aspects to your beer program that are almost impossible to maintain. And I'm not knocking those things. I'm more just suggesting that I don't know why I personally struggle with it because more breweries now are doing so many things all at once, and that's kind of the way. But for me,
that wasn't always the case. I mean, when people started off, they were focused on 1, 2, maybe 3 brands, and they were all in the same family, or you had breweries that were just dedicated to, one style. I mean, Guinness, right? I mean, it's people weren't going there for the saison.
No. And I think, the breweries that I look up at that, still kind of resonate with me, are the focus. And because there's a point where you get in this and it's almost sucks to drink beer because you can't turn anything off. You can't just sit around and enjoy a beer anymore, which is kind of the bummer of it. And I think that's why you see a lot of brewers that have been in the game for a while. My fridge is full of Pacifico, and then there's brewers that have all these other macro beers,
Yeah.
or something along those lines, and it's because it's the only thing we can drink without having to pull it apart. And but at the same time, because that's where we're at, it's hard for me to not want to focus on this thing and just make three of the best possible things that I can and constantly be sharpening that. And weirdly enough, that's like the most attractive thing to me when I started, and really up until about 3 or 4 years ago, it was like I never want to brew the same thing twice. I just constantly want to be spinning off the edge of experimentation.
But that's
And
youth. I mean, and
yeah,
and I remember talking with. I mean, there's brewers in New York. I think like Grimm early on was saying like, "Oh, we're never going to do the same beer twice," and that was a common refrain from brewers that I heard, opening up in circa 2015. Of just
yeah,
and I remember thinking to myself at the time, that sounds exhausting.
it is
And but then
exhausting.
it's also confusing to the consumer as well, where if I really liked something last week, well, I know it's not going to be there when I go back next week. So why am I going to go back? If I'm in the mood for something in particular, it's just
Yeah.
it always seemed like it was sort of a hazardous business plan.
Well, and then you'll find all of us now almost bemoaning consumers because they come in and
Careful,
it's like,
that
oh,
I'm pretty sure they're
what's
the ones that keep you open. But yeah,
oh, I know, but at the same time, there's not a brewer in the world who doesn't sit around and go, "Oh, I dislike this about the clientele now." And I guess my point is we sat there and spun off in all these directions where it's like, "Oh, we brewed 127 beers, in 2017." And then we'll all sit around and bemoan the fact that everybody who comes in wants to know what's new since last week.
yeah,
And it's like, well, we did that. So it's like we want to talk shit about that or explain how naive we think that is or whatever, but it was our own naivety that kind of conducted that. And we were the ones that were producing a beer a week, and we got people used to that. And so when they come in now, it's like, oh man, you guys ever gonna put something new on draft? It's like, God, I put something new last Tuesday.
yeah.
And it's it's just never fast enough. But I think we've created that through kind of what we did 2014 to 2018.
So how do you reframe the conversation then for the people who come in, looking for something newer than last Tuesday? Because you're right, the people walk in and they'll say, what's new, what's rare, what's local. And I want to say it was Matt Brendelson years ago who told me those were the three most dangerous words. Uh, Although it wasn't, now that I'm thinking about it, it was Ted Whitney, who was at 21st Amendment at the time. The
Okay.
three most dangerous words were new, rare, and local. But that's what people had, come to expect. So how do you reframe that conversation? Especially in an area where there is such interest now, and in relationship to the rest of the country, your brewing scene is relatively new.
Hmm. Yeah. It's relatively new, but at the same time, I think those early Prairie years have had maybe even somewhat more of an effect on the brewing scene um, than, let's say, like a brewing scene that got established 5 or 6 years earlier.
Okay.
Um, because, for like, as far as beer traders and rare beer and stuff like that, you will not find a brand that had more power than Prairie, in the early days. Like all of those bomb variants and stuff like that. I mean, people posting pictures in front of 7 and 8 cases and knowing what the secondary market value of that was stuff that was happening here like 6 years ago,
Yeah.
and I think so. What's really weird is, at any given time in your tap room, you have 5 of those folks, and then you have 5 people who have never been to a brewery, and they're like grandkids or their sons or daughters are taking them for like a fun local activity, and they're visiting three, microbreweries on a Saturday. And so you have this kind of wide range of people to appease. Um, and for us, we're not necessarily trying to, uh, I wouldn't say that we're trying to have this conversation about what people should and shouldn't be after, or if you're wanting to go, check in some new beers on a tap, like that's a thing you can do. And, the places that are best for doing that. We, we mostly are just trying to be that consistent brewery where when you walk in, and this happens all the time, they'll go and they'll be sitting there with the beers that they bought, earlier that day, for beer releases. And then they'll sit there and actually drink 4 Pilsners at the bar.
Yeah.
And, and for me, that's perfect, because it's other breweries that are in the niche of lines and beer releases. And then our brewery is serving exactly what it's supposed to do, which is you can come and spend $5 to $6 for beers that you just want to drink at a bar. And I don't think you necessarily have to create the conversation. If somebody wanted to sit down and go, man, why aren't you guys releasing stuff every single week? And I have a narrative for that, but I don't really have to talk about it maybe as much as you would think.
So you've put a lot of your focus these days on lagers. And I've had the chance to sample through a bunch of them recently for some upcoming wine enthusiast panels, and I didn't know what I was drinking at the time, and then got to do the reveal, and I really dug what you were doing, and there's a lot of talk about brewers doing lagers these days, but it's usually part of a larger program. It's like, well, here's our, our 3 barrels, and that's our barrel program. And here's our foeder, and this is our mixed fermentation. And here's our stout program, and here's our adjunct stout program. Oh yeah, and those are the lagers. But have you seen our West Coast IPAs and our East Coast IPAs? Right. You putting all of this focus on, or so much of your focus on lagers. And you mentioned, having a fridge full of Pacifico. What's driving that these days? Why the lager focus?
I think you're going to see some of that. It's kind of the same. If you look back at all those times in the past, like, let's just say 5 years, where there were moments of just weird, like this year, it was about this kind of beer. A lot of brewers drive that. It starts happening, and then through talking to all the other brewers in their circles, it starts getting out there and people start doing it. And, and it becomes a thing. And I think when you look at lager, you look at kind of the prevailing demigods of beer, and they're all talking about it, and that's, and then you have a lot of these younger brewers that are storming social media, trying to define who they are within, the scene, and who they want to become. And all of the people
storming
that carry
social media, yeah.
That's
a great way of putting it. It's true though. Yeah.
Yeah, I call them social media brewers, where it's, not necessarily their own identity, their own experiences, their own kind of gathering of these things that slowly translated into who they've become. It's looking at the most valued breweries for whatever reason, and looking at what they're talking about romantically and trying to become that themselves. And and it's I think there's that piece. I think the other piece is you have a bunch of brewers that are completely exhausted by these things where it's like, how many Oregon fruit purees do you need in a beer anymore, and it's you're sitting there making these beers that turn in 5 days, but it takes you 24 hours to like adjunct them properly. And that, I think, tears away at the thing that they envision themselves doing. And so you have multiple ways of getting to it, but and it's also like, how often can really people maintain these like 8 and 9% profiles? As far as like, it kind of moves outside of what beer has served for the populace for so long. And I'm not dissing those things. I'm not saying, I mean, you can walk into my tap room and I have 2 beers that are over 9% right now. But I'm saying, I think that there's a lot of people that understand that kind of this niche that beer has always served is a thing where you can have 4 or 5 of them and it doesn't ruin your day. And I think that really appeals to a lot of people, even the people that are buying those heavy hitters, because there are moments where that doesn't work and you can't really, bring those into the circumstance of your day.
You mentioned,
and so I think all those kind of create this perfect kind of like why you see so much lager getting talked about right now.
What I found interesting though is when you were talking about having Pacifico in your fridge, or people who have Modelo or Banquet or whatever, it's beer. I think you said it's beers you don't have to pick apart. It's beers that you just kind of drink and enjoy. So many of the, I think by nature of being craft or being small or whatever, people pick apart lagers that are being made by brewers of your size. Is the goal to get to that Pacifico part where, not necessarily size, but where people can just drink it and not have to think about it?
Yeah, I mean, the way I always kind of talk about lager or Kolsch is the beauty of those beers for me is the ability to all at once be profound while maintaining simplicity. And so, yeah, you're going to have people that just, especially, the demographic that I'm thinking about are those folks that basically, have no experience outside of the macro world. And they're going to come in and they're going to actually be talking before they even get your beers about how they're probably not going to like them because they're too pretentious. And then they're going to get a flight. And for me, that's my favorite customer, because I'm going to hit them with Kolsch, Mexican lager, Pils, and American light lager. And it will be probably the first flight that they've ever drank the whole thing. And, and that's that person will walk away going, oh, I just could gulp those beers like I do other beers. And that's the entire experience for them. But I think that there are plenty of people who are into investigating beer that can still have that same experience, with lager and Kolsch as well. I'm not saying that they should be up to that, but there is, for me, there's this perfect, whenever I'm drinking Pilsner, I mean, I still have to be careful because when I'm drinking mine, it definitely is an evaluation, and it always will be. And if I don't nail the bitterness on it, I'm super pissed, and it drives me nuts. And for me, that's like a major piece of Pils. It's like when you can kind of get that thing that smells like mineral bread, like in the nose, and then it never, the bitterness never is a thing that you think about, but it comes in and keeps it from any sort of sweetness. I love that. That to me is the best experience in beer you can have. And when I don't hit that, I definitely know that I didn't, and I'm frustrated as hell until the next batch goes on.
Which, takes a couple weeks, I imagine. So
it takes, I mean, our turnaround for our Pils is right about 38, 39 days. And so I'm pissed for like a month.
one of the beers that I had from you was an American light lager,
Yeah.
and for so long, and I think thanks to great marketing by Stone and some of the other early adopters in the space, where it was like, we don't want Bud Light, we're the anti Bud Light, we don't want fizzy yellow, whatever. I love that brewers are making American light lagers these days, and you're never going to be able to compete on the scale of Anheuser-Busch InBev. Um, but what do you like about making that style? Why make that style? I mean, there's a lot of interesting lagers out there and a lot of interesting flavor profiles. American light lager doesn't necessarily often pop up to the top of my list as compelling taste wise. What's the appeal for you?
Yeah. I think, I mean, the easy one is that I just love rice and corn and beer. Um, I love the way those things play out. I love how they change the profile. So obviously playing with Mexican lager and American light lager, you get to work with those ingredients. And for me, I use grits a lot. It's kind of a local adjunct that brings about those similar profiles. And so it's fun from a recipe development standpoint. But I think, for me, the heart of those beers is I'm an angler. And those are things that are just as much part of a fishing trip as anything else is. Nobody's bringing IPA to a fishing trip. Um, it's,
I mean, there's that one guy, but yeah,
yeah,
he's usually passed out, before you lose sight of land. So
exactly.
I'm speaking from experience. So yeah, it's
I was going to say, you've really drawn this one up.
yeah.
This is,
Boy, you paint a pretty vivid picture of your nautical drinking experiences. Yeah.
yeah, this is, I think culturally, within anglers, like they're going to look at you weird if you show up with something that's 5% or more. That's, because the idea is this is basically replacing water for the day, and you're working hard. And it's, for me, that beer has always been Hams.
Yeah.
And and it's,
Are you a
for
Midwest
better.
guy by
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I I was born and raised in Oklahoma and grew up here. And yeah, and then whenever I've moved, like when I was in the Pacific Northwest, that beer was Rainier.
Sure.
And and it just rotates depending on where I'm living. But it's funny, I can look at like being an angler and going steelheading in the Pacific Northwest, and Rainier was always a part of that. And when you've been skunked all day by a fish and you've thrown 1,000 casts, that beer tastes better than anything on earth. And it serves as kind of a very specific thing in my head. And so having a brand that has that thing for that moment is important to me.
Earlier on in the conversation, when we were talking about the mixed fermentation stuff, you talked about burnout, and that's not something that I think gets talked about enough in the beer space these days, and or life in general, because a lot of the time we have to push these things down, or not talk about our mental state of things. When you recognize that in yourself, how did things change for you, business wise, beer wise? I mean, personally is going to be your own business, but when you can start to address burnout, did you notice a difference around the brewery?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's the most, I remember when Sean Hill was talking about alcoholism needing to be a thing that's brought up, on like a national level within
Yeah.
the industry. I think equally important is burnout, and depression, based around this idea that you're working, you know, it is not at all unheard of to pull 70 and 80 hour work weeks in this industry, and it doesn't change the fact that you're still going to be making $40,000 a year.
Yeah.
And or you're in
On
a
a good
spot,
year. Yeah.
yeah, or you're in a spot where you know you've transitioned from being a brewer to an owner, and you're looking at your SBA loan bill coming in every month, and there's no amount of hours that you can do to change what's going on. And that stuff needs to be talked about and addressed. And I'm pretty quick, I guess, to, I don't know, institute that and direct that. I mean, my friend circle of brewers that, we have a text thread that we're constantly talking in. And I'm pretty quick to, check in on that. And they're pretty quick to, talk about how they think about quitting the industry every single day. And it's a thing that exists for sure. And I think until you're willing to talk about it, I mean, it's only going to get worse, because the things that are bringing that about are not going to change. And so I think it's an important deal to kind of get in with a bunch of people and to talk honestly. I have a friend who's been in the industry for just as long as I have, and he's a well-known brewer. And he was asking me, he's like, do you find that it's hard to think about yourself outside of this industry? And that's the ultimate thing, I think, is once you get in this, you gain a reputation, and it's very easy for you to kind of put your entire identity into what people think of you in the beer world as.
Yeah.
And for me, I'm lucky, I guess, because I have all these other interests that kind of save me, I guess, from that. But the amount of people in this industry that, the thing that they hold on to the most is what those people that come into their tap room say about them and their beer. And that can be a powerful thing for good, but I think it can also wreck you.
As you think about education, you think about evolution, you think about how your own brewery has changed, even since it opened. You're focused on lagers right now, and doing a bang up job on it. What's in the back of your mind? What's starting to bubble up to the surface? What's next? Does there have to be something next?
I think for me, a thing that's also been a part of this brand since we opened that's equally important. I wasn't really talking to anybody about the beer during the build out. It was just kind of like I knew what I wanted to do and kind of trusted it. But I wanted to be a place that had a really major impact on the community. And so, I mean, we're constantly doing beers that, $1 from every pour and $1 from every 4-pack, goes to a cause. And we were kind of a philanthropist of sorts, is the way I see it. And as far as like the future for us, I'm almost more interested in that than, well, I could see Saison coming back in 2 years and I'd really be interested to speak to that. It's like, I think less of that, and more about how can Heirloom impact Tulsa for good. And the future of the brand for me looks like that. We talk all the time, me and my business partner, about becoming employee owned, and the core people that are a part of building out what Heirloom becomes, giving them percentages of ownership, because I know for a fact that you can't really make a career in a mid-sized brewery like forever.
Yeah.
It's an extremely hard thing to do. And so making that possible, where someone doesn't hit where most brewers, cellarmen, sales, where most people hit is like 6 years in. They're like, well, I've hit the ceiling, and if this is the ceiling, I'm fucked. And I want to try my best to make sure that if you're a part of Heirloom, you know, that ceiling can go as high really as you want it to, and you're participating in the height of the ceiling and in the philosophy of the brand. And I think for me, as I get older, those things become just as important as the beer we're producing. You know, if I have a bunch of disgruntled employees and I'm constantly having to manage that disgruntlement, like, I have failed in the same way that I have failed if my beer sucks.
I like that. I mean, that you're thinking long term, but that you're also thinking about the people that are there with you. And I know a lot of brewers might have that somewhere in the back of their mind, or owners might have that in the back of their mind, but to actually be verbalizing it and to putting it out there into the universe, I like hearing that. So thank you.
Yeah. I hope I can make it happen.
Yeah. I mean, that's the other, that's the hard work. That's the tricky part. But
right.
Before I let you go, I just want to talk about your social media pages for just a second, because what struck me as I've been going through them leading up to this interview, you put a lot of beer into, and I hesitate to call them glasses because most of them look like flower vases.
Right.
You're non-traditional in your drinkware choices, and it's fun to look at, if not a little impractical. And are you drinking out of these, or is this just good photo for social media?
It's totally photo generated. I mean, this garage sale of glassware that we have is more of a. I think it's actually one of those things too that when I see those things, it's such a testament to the people who work here, which is also a big thing for me. Is I've never wanted to be the face of this brand, and I'm not the face of it. It's actually more likely that you're going to see my employees, you know, you're going to see them 10 times more often. Jess might post 1 or 2 pictures of me a year, because that's about what I'll allow. And the brand is totally taken on this kind of perception that's more about my employees than me. And I think that what you just pointed out is such a indicator of that, because that's, you know, Jess is always just like, how can I make this thing look more like a potion than you know, just a boring ass glass of beer, where we talk monotonously about ingredients and things no one understands. How can we sell this as more of this environment that we're trying to create, versus, you know, this is our favorite glass that we put our favorite beer in, and here's all the ingredients and the fermentation schedule.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm glad that that's something that that reached you, because that's definitely the embodiment of my employees and their creativity and their voice coming through.
Well, cool. I like it. Everybody should go check out the Instagram page that I'm talking about. I think it's just Heirloom Rustic Ales on Instagram. So go check that out. And Jake, thanks for sitting down and taking the time and talking with me today. I really appreciate the insights that you're sharing, and looking forward to more lager and to actually getting back to Oklahoma and drinking it inside of your place, which can't happen soon enough as far as I'm concerned. So thanks again for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That's Jake Miller of Heirloom Rustic Ales, although maybe they need a name change with all the lagers coming out of their cellar these days. Anyway, check them out, and next time you're in the neighborhood, stop by and have a pint of lager. And before we go, a quick reminder. Make sure to head over to Facebook and join the This Week in Rauschbier group, because there's always something smoky going on. And if beer audio is your thing, make sure you listen in to the Beer Edge podcast with Andy Crouch for deep dive conversations with interesting brewery owners and more. And also head over to beeredge.com for articles and to sign up for the newsletter. Every Monday, look for a new episode of Steal This Beer. We celebrated 300 episodes this week. And once a month, you should download the BYO Nano podcast, which is celebrating a year this month. So please don't forget to subscribe to this show and to leave a review. And you can always reach me via email at johnholl, that's JOHNHOLL @beeredge.com, or on Twitter at John_Hall. Nate Schweber does the music. Jeff Quinn designed the logo. And if you want to learn more about advertising on the show, you can send an email to Liz Melby. She's at liz@beeredge.com, and she'll get you all the information that you need. I'm John Hall. New episodes of this show release every Wednesday, and that's when I'll be back again to drink beer and to think beer.